Hi, Kathy. It is so exciting to be with you today. I am coming from Hemworth here in my little house where it is raining so much. I believe it's very similar for you. Are you in Melbourne today?
I am, Em. Nice to be here too. And yes, I'm in Melbourne today.
Funny weather today. It's raining everywhere. I don't know about the listeners, what type of weather you guys have at the moment, but I think we're set for a few days of rain, and I'm looking forward to it, Kathy. Bit of relaxation.
Absolutely. Well, that's one thing for Melbourneites. I'm from Sydney, essentially, but for Melbourne, it's known for raining and wind and sun and, every 4 seasons in a day. So it's typical then with the rain this morning.
Yes, yeah, 4 seasons in a day. We get similar where I'm from in Armidale as well. I grew up there, and yeah, I'm now a director for the International Foster Carers Organisation, which is the awesome podcast that we're on today. And I'm a secretary with them, so I get to do all that cool admin stuff. But really, really excited to be here with you, talking this podcast. Yeah, Kathy, we got to speak momentarily just before about the work that you've been doing, but I can see that you have over 4 decades experience as an advocate. That absolutely inspires me. So I would love to talk to you about, or just give the listeners a bit of info about what that 4 decades was like. That's a really long time to cover in a short moment, but just give us that snapshot, Kathy.
Yeah, thanks, Em. It does sound like a long time, but I remember the first day I started, which was what we then called years ago, district officer, which essentially was in child protection and working with children and families from different cultural backgrounds involved in child safety. And over the years, I've managed organisations. I currently work for a university. I've worked with health and education, but continuously I've worked with families and communities, and trying to understand the complexities that get involved when there are safety issues for families, why families see things differently, and importantly, why workers and practitioners and social workers and the systems sometimes don't understand what are the nuances for many children and families from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And while people want to do better in that area of work, I find that there are layers of complexities, unintended judgments that people make, organisations that don't keep good records to understand who are children and families from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. But so that my interest has always been in that area, and I've had the good fortune to work with a range of sector representatives and advocates, including government and non-government organisations. I was the deputy chair of the board called Association of Child Welfare Agencies in New South Wales, which was the peak advocacy body for child welfare organisations. I'm now on a board of another organisation that has a national lens, AusChild, which works with children and families, and working with the University of Western Sydney on a national project looking into trying to understand and improve cultural connections for children from diverse cultural backgrounds when they are in care. And I'm leading and the founder of Cultural Works, which is an organisation I set up last year to work with partner agencies interested in working better with children and families from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, so they can then do their work better. And there's a big interest in that. And obviously, I'm very grateful for the Churchill Fellowship, which will allow me this year to travel overseas and try and learn more around the practices that may be more embedded or developed that we can bring back to Australia and learn from.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Hey, the Winston Churchill Fellowship Award, something that has been running for decades, an incredible opportunity for many, many people. Anybody can kind of look into this application. It has a diverse range of different options. Our interest primarily being in community health and well-being, and that focus around the 46,000 young people in Australia that don't have long-term permanent living situations. And that's statistics that I work with every single day, Kathy. But you have a statistic there of 30% of those young people are actually of a culturally and linguistic diverse background. And that is so interesting to me. I've never known that agencies were aware of this type of demographic of young people, and I didn't know that the statistic was that large. So I'm curious to know how agencies, and I think it'd be great for our audiences to understand a bit of background, I suppose, on the family-based care system here in Australia and how agencies identify the children from diverse cultural backgrounds within that family-based care system, Kathy.
Yeah, no, really great question, Em, and we have a long way to go, having said that. So in Australia, the ideal is always to keep children safe with their families so they can be cared for in the context of family and community. When that doesn't happen, the state government usually get involved, again, try and work with families to keep them together. When that doesn't work, we look at alternative care arrangements, ideally with extended family or kinship carers, or when that's not possible, foster carers, foster families are authorised to look after the care of children. We have not enough foster carers in Australia. Unfortunately, the numbers, as you said, 45,000 are extensive in Australia. And we know that close to 50% of those children are identified as Aboriginal, First Nations children. And there's a strong focus, rightly so, to do better with those children and families and working better and more intensely and intentionally with Aboriginal leaders and communities to support families and children reconnect. 10 years ago, I started working in New South Wales in one of the first programs that looked at multicultural child and family or multicultural foster care. There were reforms happening at the government level which identified that non-government organisations were doing better in the way that they supported foster carers, care for children. And so an organisation called SSI was established took on the role of running a multicultural foster care program, and I started leading that program with a colleague called Ghazan Mujam. And what we did over those last 10 years is really look at and understand what were the issues and the complexities of understanding who were the multicultural children that were coming into our care and responsibility. And we started questioning the way the system labels or identifies multicultural children, or what the acronym is CALD, culturally and linguistically diverse. And we question that label isn't necessarily fantastic because it doesn't tell us very much around the children's profile or families. And it's not a label that is consistently recorded in the system. So while we talk about 30% of children, I talk about 30% of children being from culturally and linguistically diverse background, the data is very inconsistent because it's not mandatory and it's not kept and it's not always accurate. So we've been looking at the data in New South Wales and the recorded data indicates about 20%, but that doesn't capture all children because it relies on judgments made by a social worker or a social worker team at the time of a child's safety concern, which may not be the right information that has been discussed with the family. So over time with the Multicultural Foster Care Program, Ghazan and I started questioning how do we better understand children's cultures and so that we can be more intentional in caring for them. We had cohorts of children that we grouped under Arabic speaking or Vietnamese speaking or and other, but that wasn't good enough. We clearly found out, and I'll give you an example why. One of the children came into care early, and his family was Christian and Arabic speaking. So when we placed him in the care of an Arabic speaking foster carer, we thought we were being culturally responsive. He spoke Arabic, his family spoke Arabic, and the carer spoke Arabic. But the Arabic carers were Arabic Muslim carers, and the family was an Arabic Christian family. And in and of itself, that wasn't necessarily an issue, but for the family, we needed to talk it through. because there are issues of judgment and concerns that they had that the child wouldn't be able to go to church or practice his faith in a foster family where there were other routines influencing their care. And so it unpacked for us, it's not just ethnicity that's important, i.e. heritage, but faith was also important, and so was language. So those three elements became elements that we started being curious about to question for all our children and all our carers. And over time, for over 250 children that we cared for, they represented 60 different ethnic groups, 40 different languages, and 15 different faith groups. And so it left us curious around the diversity that we were trying to understand in culture. And that concept of CALD is really narrow. And the other thing I'd add, is that we also looked at settlement, that concept of, by default, often when we're talking about children from culturally and linguistically diverse, we default to talking about children who are refugees. And of course, that's important. But we also want to talk about children who are migrants, or their parents have been migrants. Australia is such a multicultural country, as you know, with 50% of us having either a parent born overseas or being born by ourselves, let alone the fact that we have colonised or arrived at a country and where the Aboriginal cultures were the longest living in Australia over 200 years ago. So migration is a key part of our Australian community. So that settlement journey, whether it's about the child being a refugee or a migrant or their family, influences how children and families live their lives. And that settlement journey in terms of what was happening or what in their country of origin or why they migrated or have had to come to Australia, as well as the settlement journey in Australia, influences what might be happening for a family. And in the area of child safety, that's important. So lots of issues were coming to play, which obviously influence how the sector more broadly and the government understands the children who are culturally and linguistically diverse. And hence why I think that 30% is really low.
Yeah. And I'm a bit of a data nerd, Kathy. So while you're saying these statistics and these numbers, and I really want to highlight that the research is not up to date or accurate or consistent. And I find that even in the work that I do as well. So I hear you, and it's so interesting to know that those numbers are that high. This is very new information for me, even somebody who's been in this industry for about 10 years or so. And I know for my own story, being in foster care, my cultural identity really wasn't captured properly. And my family heritage is Māori, like over in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm very lucky to be able to understand my family roots. But that only came to me when I was in my 20s and I started to search for that myself. And I'm really curious to know, when it is the main focus, when you are looking at CALD, young people, how do these agencies identify the specific cultural needs? Is there a way or a practice or tools that are implemented to try and look at this very, very broad range of different cultural needs and expectations?
Yeah, and the reality is that we're not consistently. There are pockets of really beautiful practices, and there's pockets of doing better, as I said before, with Aboriginal children because of that huge statistic. But where it's not, I also want to acknowledge that there is interest there. So the work that I've been doing through Cultural Works and the work through the National Research Program, the Australian Research Council funded program that we're doing based at New South Wales through Western Sydney University, Sydney and Macquarie, involves 8 major organisations that have both a New South Wales and a state national lens, and they're interested in doing better. So people are wanting to learn, We in Australia also, and I'm not sure to what extent this happens overseas, as part of the legislative responsibilities to caring for children, need to develop a cultural care plan for children every year that they're in care. It's not something that everybody's doing well, but it is something that we're looking at more closely in terms of what that actually means. So a cultural care plan aims to identify a child's cultural background, the diversity of their ethnicity, their language and their faith, and the issues that have influenced their families' traditions and heritage. So those conversations and that planning is being accelerated, but it's still at a slower pace. And the main reason for that is because by default, the care of children, as you may know, is often in crisis, and in foster care, stability and managing education and behaviours and trauma often take priority. And what's considered the importance of cultural connections gets maybe a second-rate consideration because of those crisis nature until children are much older. So the conversations that I'm really having and the research that we're having and our conversations today are very much trying to surface some of those issues around the importance of what I see as my responsibility and every responsibility of everybody involved in this in our area of work. That the decisions we make about what is important, and including cultural connections, have an impact on children's lives today and tomorrow. And that impact comes across by the way we question and collect information. And as you mentioned, supporting children in care know their heritage so that they can have access to that information when they choose to, when they're 5 or 10 or 15 and or beyond. But if we don't provide that information for children on an ongoing basis, if we don't collect that information and create opportunities for them to experience and understand their cultures, then we can do a disservice by not having information available to children when they're older. And which often happens when they're older, they become more curious to be connected to their culture in a more articulate way, I guess. You know, they express it more consistently, often when they're 17, 18, and like you said, in their 20s. So I'm really mindful of having these conversations, and the Churchill Fellowship has really allowed for that conversation to be escalated.
And it's so important that everybody in Australia knows that these conversations are happening and are aware that there is opportunity as well to look into foster care and look into having a family-based care system. It's so incredible to hear that there are pockets of good things happening, and I find that in the community services space in Australia as well. We have these small pockets, and it's so interesting to know that the international community, there's family-based care systems everywhere. And we are all building the same structures that are ultimately maybe not working the best.
Yes.
Some are, some aren't. So this conversation is not just for Australia and the refugee and migrant families that end up becoming based here. It's also for all of the young people that are internationally within the family-based care system who are looking to identify deeper with their culture. And I really hear what you're saying about, you know, wanting to express that when you get to like 17, 18, into your 20s. And it's almost like an embarrassing thing for me that I can't speak my language, you know. And I'm 25, turning 26, and trying to teach my son how to speak Te Reo Māori. So when we go over to New Zealand, it's like fluid. And it's such a scary thing to jump into at such a late age. And I wonder if there's strategies even in place, or if there's some sort of policy understanding. I have lived experience. I know my cultural background and how I could have used the system or organisations to help strengthen that when I was younger. But do you think the organisations know this?
Yeah. I think there's two good different points to note. And so in terms of the cultural care planning, and in terms of what organisations and teams do within an organisation, that I think is opportunities for us to look better at how to do that. So when I talk about cultural care planning, for example, I've been helping organisations who have identified children that they haven't yet done comprehensive care plans to talk to them about what could that look like, whether it's for a 2-year-old or for a 14-year-old. So we talk about those plans, obviously including the voice of the child and the voice of the carers and the voice of family members. But the sorts of things that we can explore are obviously the language of the country, the faith, where exactly your family's lived in New Zealand, or where my family has lived in Greece. Not just that my heritage is Greek, but where, like that my mum lived in a place called Giato on the beach in Corinth, and my dad came from a little village called Karyani in Corinth, which is in the south of Greece. So learning those nuances around the districts and the specifics of where family came from. But then it's also about what was the Greek community, and I'll use myself as an example, that came to Australia. So when did they migrate? What were they doing when they migrated? My family came in the late 1950s, and there was a big influx of migration. What was the music that they were listening to? Why did they come? For my family, it was economics. They had no work opportunities, so seeking employment opportunities was the reason that they came. What happened to that family, or what happened to the culture when it arrived in Australia? So many of my family's generations had their names changed because people couldn't pronounce their Greek name, and they changed their name. My mother's name, for example, was Getty Ekaterini, and she was just called Getty in Australia. So her name changed. And people changed their names because they wanted to be more anglicised or more Australian. Today, in the cultural plans for children, you can download so much in terms of music for children, particularly for young babies. There's nursery rhymes in language that can be played. There's movies and songs. For another child who was not interested in his culture more recently that I was speaking to, who's Scottish, he was, as I said, not interested in family heritage for particular reasons. But what we did was find the Scottish football team, because he's really interested in soccer and being a goalie in football. And so we started exploring international football, and then looking at the football team and who the goalies are. And it's triggering conversations that stimulate interest in country, and then having conversations and experiences, obviously with food and visiting communities, but finding those connections. So from a cultural plan, there's ways to have those dialogues and conversations that engage the child with their interests, but also their developmental stages. And then the other thing with organisations that's really important, I think, to think about is why are we not collecting data, that information on culturally and linguistically diverse? What is the organisation executive and leaders thinking about in terms of being more intentional to ask the questions, the curiosity questions, to find out the data and try and understand what the community and the cultural profile of children are, or their start? What are the partnerships that organisations have with other community or ethnic organisations so they can start learning and sharing information? And importantly for teams, there's a critical element, I think, for caseworkers and team members, and to some extent foster carers too, who are given the opportunity to think about the ideas that they have about different families' cultural profiles and what it means for them. Because unintentionally, in many situations, we can have views on different children and different cultures, and they sometimes biases. They're not always clear because we haven't had that experience and we haven't talked about our ideas and help shape more accurate information around the attitudes and values that we may have that may cloud the way we are interested in other cultures and find out more information. So conversations and training for staff and carers are really important to help elevate and think through what we call unintended cultural biases, because we make judgments based on those biases. And in child safety and foster care, we can make judgments around cultural practices and what's important and not important.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, and I really feel as though a lot of our listeners, and myself included, listen to your story. I know you only told us a small timeline of it, but understanding migrant families and refugee families, it's not like our stories are all super different, right? and like you're saying, like my family, we moved across for similar reasons, not economic, but food resources, found somewhere, all the same things, changed our names to almost like whitewash where we were in our life, and trying to claw back that information is really difficult. And I've been saying for 7 years, Kathy, that it wouldn't take much for Family and Community Services to put a little bit into Ancestry.com or a little team into My21 and these heritage DNA things that really exist now. It'd be so interesting to see that data and see where a lot of our young people come from. It also brings so much wealth of knowledge in the area, and I'd love to just promote the opportunities that young people with culturally and linguistic diverse backgrounds do have to come into social work in Australia and come into the family-based care system and share their experiences of their lifeline or their parents' life and be able to talk on that to give more information. Because like you said, lived experience is really the important part here. And cultural plans are great when they're being done properly, is what I'm hearing. That M&E and data could be more available and there could be more of it. But with those cultural plans, we're at least looking at the individual young person and what their goals could be in that area. And like you said, that's so important when it's done properly. But we also need to create the conversations and that are often quite uncomfortable to be in our training and address that cultural bias. And it's something that we have to look into ourselves every single day. Even myself being somebody who, quite young, quite woke in those senses, I constantly have to pull myself up for cultural biases because they are there and they're real. And if you're not aware of them, then maybe you're probably not doing the digging that you need to be doing about what your biases are. And I think there's listeners here that could really take what you've been saying and the research that you're looking into and what you're doing and take some really great advice from it into their practices and start suggesting that these conversations happen. So, Kathy, I think the sun's finally starting to peek through for me. Well, what about you? You're on Narmland in Melbourne, and yeah, is the weather getting better?
I think it's going to be a nice one today. I think this summer season will be starting before any other seasons today, Em. So yeah,
it'll be nice. You have to peel off the jumpers and the raincoats and. Yeah, we'll get kicking on today. This has been fantastic, Kathy. I love speaking to you today, and I don't think this conversation will end here. So thank you so much for joining us on the IFCO podcast, and I really look forward to touching base with you after you've done your research. Really exciting stuff.
Very happy to be sharing it.
Thanks heaps, Kathy.
For your time. Cheers.
Bye.